It was June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, when Samuel Little was born. Raised in a troubled family, his mother, Bessie May Little, was a teenage prostitute who abandoned him early on. Samuel's childhood was marked by neglect and emotional turmoil, but no one could have predicted the horrific future that awaited him. From a young age, he exhibited signs of disturbing behavior. His fascination with strangulation and his obsession with true crime stories became evident early in life. Little's obsession with violence, particularly towards women, became a dark obsession that would only grow over time, leading to an unimaginable series of events. But how did a man with such a history become one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history? As the years went on, Samuel Little's criminal behavior escalated. From petty theft to violent assaults, he racked up numerous arrests across several states. However, it wasn't until 1984 that his deadly path truly began to take shape. Little was arrested for the brutal kidnapping, beating, and attempted strangulation of 22-year-old Lori Barros in California, an attack that nearly claimed her life. This incident would prove to be just the beginning of a decade-long killing spree that spanned across the United States. Little's method was chillingly efficient. He preyed on vulnerable women, often prostitutes or drug users, and killed them with the same twisted obsession that had festered since his childhood. As Little's killing spree continued, it seemed as though he would never be caught. But in 2012, when Little was finally arrested, the full extent of his brutal crimes began to unfold. Little would later confess to 93 murders over 4 decades. But how was it that a man with such a horrific history managed to slip through the cracks for so long? And who were the victims left behind in his wake? The chilling truth was only beginning to emerge, and the investigation into his dark past would reveal a history of violence, manipulation, and psychological terror that no one could have predicted. After decades of evading justice, Samuel Little was finally apprehended on September 5, 2012, at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. At first, it seemed like another routine arrest for a man with a criminal history. Little was initially taken into custody on a narcotics charge, but authorities quickly realized they had a far more dangerous individual in their hands. DNA testing connected him to the murders of 3 women in Los Angeles, and soon after, a terrifying truth began to emerge. Little, a man who had been living on the fringes of society, was not just another criminal. He was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. As Little was interrogated, the police soon discovered the chilling depth of his crimes. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program confirmed that Samuel Little was linked to at least 60 confirmed murders, but Little himself claimed responsibility for as many as 93 murders spanning a staggering 35 years, from 1970 to 2005. His victims, mostly women, were often vulnerable, many of them sex workers or those battling addiction. Little confessed to strangling each victim, leaving behind a series of broken lives and unsolved mysteries across multiple states. But how had he been able to evade detection for so long? The truth was unsettling. Little knew exactly how to avoid detection. Over the years, Samuel Little moved around the country, never staying in one place for too long. He worked odd jobs, including as a cemetery worker and ambulance attendant, often blending into the communities he lived in. He was a master manipulator, preying on women who were less likely to be missed. His modus operandi was disturbingly simple. He would overpower his victims, strangle them, and leave them in remote locations, often undressed, making it difficult for authorities to identify the cause of death or even connect the murders to a single individual. His ability to blend in and the lack of forensic technology at the time allowed him to continue his killing spree for decades. But even more chilling than his confessions were the sketches. Samuel Little had drawn portraits of many of his victims, 26 in total, and these haunting images were released by the FBI in hopes of identifying the unknown women. As investigators began to sift through these sketches, a new mystery unfolded. Could these drawings help uncover more victims and perhaps finally bring closure to unsolved cases that had been haunting the country for decades? Little's confessions were only the beginning, and the real question now was, how many more murders had he committed that no one knew about? Forensic experts, detectives, and law enforcement agencies across the United States scrambled to match these sketches to cold cases that had long gone unsolved. The images, often of women in their 20s and 30s, showed a glimpse of the lives Little had extinguished without a trace, and now these sketches became the key to uncovering the full scope of his crimes. With each victim identified, the case grew darker. Authorities confirmed that several of the women depicted in the sketches had indeed been murdered by Little, bringing the total number of his confirmed victims closer to 60. These women had been written off as transient, forgotten by society, often listed as missing persons or victims of overdoses or accidents. Many had been discarded in unremarkable places, alleys, abandoned buildings, or remote areas, their deaths overlooked in the rush of daily life. But the sketches were more than just art. They were pieces of a puzzle that finally gave these women a voice. Little's confessions, paired with the identities of his victims, filled in the horrifying gaps, revealing that many of these murders had occurred in plain sight, right under the noses of the authorities. In addition to these revelations, Little began to recall more murders, cases that were previously unknown, scattered across the country in places like Florida, Ohio, and California. His detailed confessions were matched with unsolved deaths, some of which had gone completely unnoticed. He had targeted women he felt no one would miss. Vulnerable, marginalized women who had been caught in the grips of addiction or were engaged in sex work. Little's ability to evade capture for so long was not just due to his movements across the country, but because his victims were often dismissed as disposable by society. Little himself had confessed that he had chosen these women because they were the least likely to be missed, a haunting statement that underscored the horrific nature of his crimes. But despite the mounting evidence and Little's admissions, the case wasn't over. As more victims were identified, it became clear that some of the women he had murdered had never been reported missing at all, leaving families wondering where their loved ones had gone. Even more disturbingly, Samuel Little's confessions continued. He claimed to have committed far more murders than the authorities had confirmed. What if some of his confessions were still yet to be solved? Could there be dozens more victims scattered across the country whose identities remained a mystery? The hunt for the full extent of his crimes was far from over, and the true scale of his brutality was still waiting to be uncovered. As the investigation into Samuel Little's confessions and his chilling sketches continued, the authorities were left with a haunting question. How many more victims could there be? Even with Little's detailed admissions, there remained a fear that some of his murders had been lost to time. His confessions had already implicated him in murders that spanned several decades and multiple states, yet there were still gaps in his story, cases that had not yet been solved, and women whose identities remained unknown. As the FBI worked tirelessly to match his confessions with cold cases, the fear grew that there were more nameless victims, still lost in the shadows of Little's dark past. In 2018, Little began to share more specific details about his murders, sometimes recalling the smallest details that only the killer would know. He offered these confessions in exchange for better prison conditions, but what he revealed was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. His willingness to talk about his past, paired with the investigative work of law enforcement, led to more victims being identified, yet not every confession could be verified. In total, 60 confirmed murders and 93 total confessions were attributed to him. Little's ability to recall such detailed personal information about each victim was chilling, revealing the depth of his obsession with his crimes and how long he had evaded justice. But despite the groundbreaking revelations, the story of Samuel Little didn't end with his confessions. He continued to taunt investigators with claims of more unsolved cases, and while the FBI had closed the book on many of his murders, there remained the unsettling thought that the full scale of his violence would never be fully understood. What made the case even more tragic was the fact that many of his victims had lived their lives on the fringes of society. Women who were easy to overlook and who, in some cases, were never even reported missing. Little's killings became a stark reminder of how easily some people can fall through the cracks, never to be heard from again. As the investigation closed in on its final chapters, a significant development occurred. Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in American history, was finally facing justice for his decades of terror. In 2014, he was convicted of 3 murders in Los Angeles, and his confession for the other 60 confirmed murders ensured he would never leave prison. Despite his claims to have killed over 90 people, his true motives, deep-rooted in his twisted delusions, would forever remain a mystery. Little died on December 30th, 2020, at the age of 80, while serving a life sentence at California State Prison, Los Angeles County. What do you think about Samuel Little's confessions? Did he truly kill 93 women, or were there more we haven't discovered? What does this case teach us about the vulnerable lives of people often overlooked by society? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime cases.